Hello and welcome to Inforendum Part 2. If you've seen Part 1, you'll know that there we compared whether Scotland would be better off today if it was independent compared to the rest of the UK. In this video, Part 2, we're looking at the situation over the next 50 years. And again, the question is really, will we be better off as an independent country compared to being part of the UK? So a quick reminder what we looked at last time, how the economy works in very simple terms. So we get money in to the government that comes in taxes for all our income tax and VAT, etc., and North Sea oil revenues. Comes into the government. In addition, the government borrows some money and then the whole lot goes back out again in public spending, and some of the money also goes to pay the interest on the debt that we borrowed. So this is managed, comes down to what's known as the fiscal choices. I'm sure you've heard the politicians and economists bandy this word around, but fiscal is just a fancy word that means how much tax and how much to spend in the economy. So comparing to the previous slide, we have the tax revenues or the money coming in, and the blue bar is the spending that goes out on all our public services like the NHS and paying for our pensions, etc. And the difference between those two things is what the government has to borrow. And of course these fiscal choices are things that the government makes. We're all familiar with lots of different governments. They can decide to tax more or tax less. They can decide to spend more or spend less. So the way that all of this is managed really comes down to the government of the day. So if we want to look at the outlook for Scotland's economy, it makes sense to look at a period over the next 50 years. It's particularly important with this referendum coming up because we really are making a one-time decision. Some of us may not be here in 50 years' time, but we still care about what's left for our children and our grandchildren. And there are also 16-year-olds voting in the referendum who for the most part probably will still be here in 50 years time. So I think everyone wants to make sure that they make the right decision, not just for today but for the future. So in order to look at the economy for the next 50 years, we're fortunate in having a fairly extensive report that's been done by an independent body, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, that word fiscal again. Now, as we know, no one's really got a crystal ball that will tell us exactly what happens in the future. There are always lots of variable factors that can come into play. So one of the nice things that has been done in this report is that they looked at a variety of scenarios, and they're able to tell us what might be the best case and also what might be the worst case by making different assumptions about the way that things will develop over time. So what did this conclude after doing all of the detailed analysis comparing Scotland to the UK? Well, the conclusions, I'll show you a couple just in a second, but basically there are some economic challenges in the future if Scotland becomes an independent country. This is a direct quote from the report from the IFS. It says Scotland would require a significant additional fiscal tightening over and above that already announced by the UK government in order to bring its long-term public finances onto a sustainable footing. Express it another way, another quote from the report, just as the Office of Budget Responsibility has pointed out that the UK as a whole faces some serious fiscal choices over the medium and longer term, it's clear that an independent Scotland would face even tougher choices. And in more simple terms, they also say that significant tax rises and/or spending cuts would be required in order to ensure that Scotland's public finances follow a sustainable path over the long term. And to compare that to what would happen if Scotland remained part of the UK, they use this measure they call the fiscal gap. So in the long run, Scotland's fiscal gap would be between 2 times and 7 times worse than the UK as a whole. Fiscal gap is kind of a technical term that's to do with the way that debt builds up over time, but the bigger the fiscal gap, basically the worse things are. So a low fiscal cap is good. So what are Scotland's choices to deal with all of this? Well, we're really up to the Scottish Government to decide, but one thing they could do is to reduce the spending. Remember, on this diagram, the yellow bit is the amount that the government has to borrow each year, and the problem with a fiscal gap is that over time you have to keep borrowing more and more, and eventually it becomes unsustainable because effectively your credit rating goes down. You've borrowed so much that no one will lend you any more money, and that's when countries run into real problems, as we've seen with some recent examples in Europe and elsewhere. So if you want to reduce the amount of borrowing, there's a couple of ways you can do it. One way is to reduce the blue bar so that you reduce the borrowing, which is the gap between how much you spend and how much you bring in. So in the report, the IFS have considered that and put some numbers around it, and here's what they say. First of all, this kind of adjustment, you would need to start making these changes from around about the year 2021 onwards in order to have a sustainable economy. To put some numbers around it, you'd need to reduce public spending by about 6%, and that's in the best case. And in the worst case, you'd need to reduce public spending by 19%. And if you take the midpoint of those, what that means in money terms is to cut about £6 billion out of Scotland's public spending. And the last couple of years, Scotland's total spending has been about 65 billion. So it's a sizable amount if that's the approach that's taken to deal with this challenge. The way to do it is to increase the green bar, the spending, the amount of taxes that are coming in. So we can do that, and that will reduce the borrowing requirement as well. So putting some numbers around that, what that looks like, again, the time scale for doing it is the same from about 2021 onwards. In the best case, you would need to increase the income tax by about 8%, or you could apply the increase to VAT, which would need to go up by about 7%, and that's the best case. If you look at the worst case, it would be over 3 times worse than that. So that's kind of the summary of what the experts are saying about how Scotland's economy might evolve to the UK. If you want more detail in this, we're doing a kind of an extended part 2B that's got a bit more information that talks about the differences between the best and worst case scenarios that were used, and it also talks about the reason why Scotland ends up this way with a more challenging economic prospect than the UK. Of course, you could also look at the full report itself, which is on the website of the Institute of Fiscal Studies on that link there. So it just remains to say thank you.